The Nikon Z6 II launched at £2,000, which was a lot of money, but was in line with what people expected after the Nikon Z6. It added a second Expeed 6 image processor to give it faster autofocus, better detection capabilities in autofocus, and indeed general usability improvements. It was, however, pretty much an identical camera versus the Z6 in terms of size, weight, the same accessories worked on Z6 II that worked on Z6, etc. So it's a very much an iterative approach. Even the body shape was pretty much identical. It did, however, add the second card slot and gave us an SD card slot, which was something that a lot of people wanted. The Nikon Z6 III is a complete rework of the Nikon Z6 II and Z6. It no longer shares the same body shape. Instead, it's added 50 grams to its weight, it's become thicker, and as a result, perhaps slightly easier to hold. It's changed its screen type from a flip screen to a fully articulating screen, and it has added a plethora of features as a result of the Expeed 7 image processor that it's borrowed from the Nikon Z9, Z8, ZF, etc. So let's start off with the big question. Is it worth the upgrade? And I hate to be that person, but it really depends on what you currently think of the Nikon Z6 II. For me, the Nikon Z6 II's autofocus, for the most part, was pretty much all right. It did the job that I needed it to do, and it did it fairly well. I was, however, left wanting in some scenarios when it came to video. I found sometimes it would lose focus, it wouldn't lock onto people's eyes as much, and as I use it nowadays a lot as a B camera, with it side on to the subject I'm recording, I find that it does miss the actual eye quite often, so its autofocus is by no means infallible. But it had the features that I needed and a lot of people still need. You know, it can do ProRes recording with an external recorder at 4K 60 frames per second, which is pretty impressive for a camera even today. And it is a very pleasant camera to use. There is, however, a problem if you're a sports photographer, a wildlife photographer, and you want to use subject detection. It isn't fantastic. Having now spent 4 or 5 months with the Nikon Z8, it's quite clear to me that there is a serious jump from the Expeed 6 or even dual Expeed 6 processors to the Expeed 7 processor. So whether you should upgrade or not very much depends on whether you want to spend the money and whether or not you need the additional capabilities. If you're perfectly happy with your Z6 II today, there is no need to upgrade. You're not going to be experiencing massive FOMO. Yes, the Z6 III has some more advanced features and additional features, but I don't think they're going to set the world on fire as much as people might think. That is if you're happy with that camera, of course. If you do feel that it's lacking, the Z6 III adds a lot of features in both video and photo modes. Speaking to video, we go from 4K to 6K recording. All of it can be recorded internally into the camera onto the Compact Flash Express card Type B. So we're talking Nikon N-RAW, which is something the Z6 II couldn't do at all. ProRes RAW 12-bit, you don't need to pay additional money for that. It works straight out of the box. ProRes, all internally on the camera, 6K, 4K, it's literally all there. It can also handle slow-mo at full HD at up to 240 frames per second, which is an impressive stat even today looking at flagship cameras, so that's pretty impressive too. When it comes to photo modes, the Z6 III has had serious upgrades as well, not least in the autofocus department. So the biggest one here is, of course, being able to use subject detection that's much more accurate both for people and animals. It also has a dedicated car and plane tracking mode as well. Now, something that's absent on the Z6 III versus the Z8 and Z9 is bird detection. Hopefully that gets added with a firmware update, but we're yet to see that. There are other benefits as well if you're a photographer. Frame rates is one of them. This will shoot up to 16 frames per second with the electronic shutter with full autofocus and exposure control, which is fantastic. I think it's up to 12 frames per second if you have the actual main shutter in the camera active. Then it also has a partially stacked sensor. It's not a fully stacked sensor like we've seen in Z8 and Z9, but this partially stacked sensor also gives you benefits. Less rolling shutter, which if you're shooting the electronic shutter and it's a fast moving object, you're going to get less of that sort of jelly effect, as it gets called, which means better images, essentially. Another thing that the Z6 III brings is Nikon's imaging cloud, which will give you access to your own custom and other people's picture profiles, so image profiles, so you can apply them directly to your images. I believe that's just for JPEGs rather than RAWs, though I think you can carry it over into NX Studio into the actual RAW file if you want. I'm fairly certain. So I haven't had a chance to play with that as much because I've been struggling with the imaging cloud a bit. That's my fault, not Nikon's. But either way, that's another benefit if you like that kind of thing too. And I think overall, ergonomically, it's a nicer camera to hold for a longer period of time due to the slightly larger grip. I do think I prefer it over the Z6 II, and as a result, that might give you a more enjoyable shooting experience than the Z6 II does. I also really like, and this is a small thing, but the Z6 II's OLED display on the top of the camera goes completely blank when it's switched off. So there's no information there, whereas the Z6 III's will actually continue to show you how many images you've got left on the memory card. Now, I find that really useful because it tells me whether or not I have a memory card in the camera, because it is still something that I have done embarrassingly often, which is run out without a memory card in one of my cameras, and it's obviously then a wonderful shooting experience, or having to go out and buy a cheap SD card if you can find one. So I actually really like the fact that it has that always active display that will at least tell you whether or not you have a card in it. It's something I really appreciate on my Z8 as well. The flipping screen on the back, that's something some people really like. So obviously it means that if you're sort of shooting videos or vlogging, or indeed shooting selfies to a certain extent, you can do that a bit more easily. It does get in the way of the cables on the side, but that's something you have to decide whether you want to deal with or not. I actually prefer the flip screen from the Z6 II over the Z6 III fully articulating display. It is more handy for video, but actually for the most part, the flip screen is just more handy generally. So that's a Marmite thing. You're either going to love it or you're not. The internal EVF, the electronic viewfinder on the Z6 III, is hugely improved on that of the Z6 and indeed any other Nikon camera currently available in November 2024. It is brighter, it is higher resolution, and it is more color accurate. The thing is, you won't notice. That's the brutal honesty. If you're shooting photographs, I genuinely don't think you'll notice. If you're shooting video or HDMI images, you will notice, because it will actually be able to represent those that style image on the EVF, which you couldn't do with the Z6 II. But again, if you have that use case specifically, that's something you'll notice. Something across video and photography is the in-body image stabilization. If you rely on that a lot, the Z6 III's is the best that Nikon currently has to offer, and offers up to 8 stops of in-body image stabilization. That is a big improvement over the 5.5 stops that the Z6 II has. Now, I didn't notice it as much even when I did some low-light photography with the Z6 III. But again, there are going to be circumstances where that's really helpful, and if that's your kind of thing, that's something to be aware of too. Now, the Z6 III uses Nikon's latest EN-EL15C battery over the EN-EL15B that the Z6 II uses. That gives you slightly higher capacity in the Z6 III, but it comes at a cost. That cost is that all your third-party batteries that you might have bought for your Z6 II will not work in your Z6 III. It's really annoying. It's completely arbitrary given the fact they work in my Z8. I hate that kind of thing. I think it's intentionally creating e-waste. So shame on Nikon for that one. There's no reason to lock down your batteries, in my opinion. If you want to take the risk and use a third-party battery, you should absolutely have that choice in your own device. But in this case, what can you do? Nikon has blocked it and there isn't a way around it. I know people like SmallRig's latest versions of their batteries will work in here, but if you have like a blue EN-EL15C, it will not work. But if you have the orange one, it will. Very frustrating, nothing much we can do about it. Nikon has also changed the button layout on the Z6 III over the Z6 II, and that is a positive improvement. So for one, they've moved exposure compensation next to the ISO button, which is great because on the Z6 II it was miles away to the right of the on-off button and the shutter button. Don't know what that was about. It was always really hard to get to, so your fingers are going to be less cramped getting to it, which is nice. And Nikon has gone back to its standardized format of having the play button in the bottom right-hand corner rather than the top left, which is what they're using on the Z8 and Z9. It just means it falls into, you know, those other cameras and is a little bit more similar to those. It's, again, Whether you like that or not is up to you. It might be some getting used to. I've got used to it really quickly and it doesn't bug me. However, if it does annoy you, there's nothing stopping you reprogramming the buttons and having them that way round, because Nikon will let you do that. So that is fine too. I think at this point we should probably address one of the controversies of the Z6 III, and that is the uproar. And it was an uproar about the dynamic range capabilities of the Z6 III. I believe it is due to the partially stacked sensor. We've lost some dynamic range versus the Z6 II. I haven't noticed it much, to be honest with you. I've spent a lot of time staring at raw images and editing them and staring at log video and color grading it, and I just can't tell. To me, that loss in dynamic range hasn't really affected me. Now, if you're someone that shoots in extreme circumstances, whether it's bright, dark, challenging lighting situations, you might notice that lack of dynamic range, okay? And in that case, this might not be the camera for you. It's something to consider if that is going to affect you. However, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that 99% of people probably won't notice that by this camera. If that percentage is higher, I apologize, but that's just my take on it. I didn't really notice there being a huge difference. But again, it's something to be aware of and something to consider. The biggest problem with the Z6 III when it launched was price, and it is what stopped me ordering one to begin with. At launch, it cost £2,700 or $2,700 US. That was too much, especially in Europe. It was a £700 price jump over the Z6 II, and I think a lot of people weren't expecting it to be that big. It was £200 more than the sort of worst case scenario that I imagined, and as a result, I didn't buy one. I did go out and buy another Nikon camera. I bought the Nikon Z8 because at the time it was on offer, and I managed to get it for like £200-300 more than the Z6 III, and for me that was great. I was like, that's a more capable camera, allows me to do some different things. But if you're just looking for a straight upgrade from the Z6 II, a Z6 II, by the way, which on the used market is worth about £1,000 at this stage, it's a pretty bitter pill to swallow. At the moment, the Nikon Z6 III is on offer at £2,300 or $2,500 US. At that price point, in my opinion, it's a much better value, and if I was in the same situation now that I was a few months ago, I would go out and buy the Z6 III. But I've already made my choice and I've already spent my money, so that's where I'm standing is with the Z8, which I'm very happy with, and I have a video comparing the Z6 III to the Z8 linked above in case that's something you want to consider as well. But again, that's worth considering. You still have the same 2 card slots as the Z6 II. As I say, the body shape is very similar, though it is thicker and slightly heavier. It uses the newer battery, and overall it is an improvement in almost every way over the Z6 II. As with the Z6 II, it's really important that if you buy this camera, you spend time customizing it. These cameras are hugely capable, but some of the features are sort of hidden away in menus and sub-menus, so make sure you spend some time learning about the camera and getting the most from it, especially when it comes to the autofocus modes. I, for instance, really like linking the AF on button to 3D tracking, which means no matter which focus mode I'm in, if I hit AF on and hit the shutter button, I'm immediately in 3D tracking on whichever object is in the center of the screen. Super handy for me if I'm out and about shooting something and then suddenly I see some wildlife I want to take a photo of or something else. I'm immediately there regardless of which shutter mode I was in. Autofocus mode I was in. So that's something worth considering too. The video capabilities of the Z6 III are hugely superior to the Z6 II, so if you're mostly a video shooter, it is a big upgrade and you will notice it, and that internal recording can be super handy. However, worth remembering, you can still record ProRes externally via a monitor via the full-size HDMI port on the side. That's another big upgrade. We've gone from mini HDMI to full-size HDMI. It's harder to break, the cables are easier to get hold of. It's generally a big quality of life improvement in my mind. And I also like the fact that it's just easier to get to as well, and that bigger port, I'd much prefer it. And also the audio input has been improved too. The microphone port on this camera it's a better preamp, and it also has some compatibility with a specific Tascam recorder that can record a high quality audio stream directly into the camera. Super handy as well, so that's something to look out for too. So that is my quick rough and ready overview of the Z6 III to Z6 II and some of the pluses and minuses. In my experience, if I had to choose between these two cameras, I would choose the Z6 III purely because I enjoy using it, and it has those better video features that I'm going to use day to day. But the thing is, the Z6 II is still my B camera, and it's still the camera I use to record the majority of my reviews, and it still does a great job at it. So in my opinion, the Z6 II is still hugely capable today. It's still a very good camera for the majority of people. And if you're thinking, actually, I don't want to spend another, let's say, £1,500 on top of the camera that I'd have to sell to pay for it, then I wouldn't really bother. I think the Z6 II is still fantastic. And in a year's time, who knows how much the Z6 III will be worth. It might be a much more affordable upgrade. If you're watching this later on, at some years in the future, and you're considering buying a Z6 III or Z6 II used, I think they're both fantastic cameras. And I'm pretty confident they're going to stand the test of time, because the original Z6 is still a great camera, and you're probably going to find that it continues to be a great camera in 3, 4, 5 years' time. One last thing to mention. I think the Z6 III is going to have the same fate as the Z6 II in terms of firmware updates. I think we'll see a few, and I think we'll see some improvements, but I don't think we'll see the same level of updates as we got with the original Nikon Z6 or the Z8 and Z9. The reason for this is the Z6 III is using the already very capable Expeed 7 processor that has been used in those aforementioned cameras. And those other cameras have seen huge amounts of firmware updates and huge amounts of features added as a result of those firmware updates. I don't think there's a huge amount more Nikon is going to be doing with this particular Expeed 7 processor, which means you're not going to have a huge amount of updates. So don't buy the Z6 III thinking, oh, it's great, I'm going to have 20 different firmware versions, and we're going to go from firmware version 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 as we have with, say, the Nikon Z9. I wouldn't expect that, and certainly not with the level of upgrades that we saw with those other cameras. So I hope you found this video useful. I tried to do this as quickly as possible, as I know these can be quite full-on videos. But if you have any more questions, or a specific question about either of these cameras related to upgrading, or indeed just their general use, pop them in the comment section below. Be happy to help. If you're looking at the Z6 III specifically, I've got a full review of it linked above that maybe contains a little bit of additional information. And then if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you really enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another video. Thanks very much for watching. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.